the 4th of July. Why do we celebrate the 4th of July?
Celebrate America.
Greg. Nice to meet you, Greg. Okay, what do we celebrate on the 4th of July?
Independence.
From?
Point.
Slavery. Cool. In Great Britain. Slavery was a little bit later. Hey, man, I'm Tim.
Hi, I'm Nick.
Nick, nice to meet you. What do we celebrate on the 4th of July?
Independence from England, yeah.
Okay. No, it's really good, though. Many people have not gotten that right. My name's Tim.
I'm Marcus.
Do you know where the Declaration of Independence was signed?
It was signed in Boston, Massachusetts.
It's not a bad guess. Do you know where that was done?
No, I don't. I don't know. I want to say Delaware.
It's a really good guess.
Hi, I'm Catherine.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, goodness. Oh, no.
Okay, I'll wait. Do you know where the Declaration was signed?
I do. Pennsylvania?
Yes, Philadelphia. Okay, yeah, very good.
Tom Mullen.
Hey, Tom, nice to meet you.
Well, that's a really tough one. So if it wasn't in Quincy, it had to be Philadelphia, huh?
That's exactly right, Philadelphia.
It was signed in Philadelphia.
Yes. Do you know where in Philadelphia?
Constitution Hall?
Okay, actually, it was in that building right there.
Oh, okay. This
So,
building right
But
here.
you haven't been there yet, right? So
Right,
you're from out of town.
Right.
You didn't know that yet.
Okay.
So when you visit that, you would get that right next time.
Just around the corner from Independence Hall is a small structure known as Carpenter's Hall. Carpenter's Hall is right behind me, and this is where the Founding Fathers first got together 2 years before they signed the Declaration of Independence. They met here at Carpenter's Hall, and they said, all right, what are we going to do? We're 13 colonies. We've been separate states. How do we join together? How do we respond to Great Britain? And so as they convened to do that, this was new for them because the guys from Georgia had never met the guys from Pennsylvania, and the guys from Massachusetts didn't know the guys from Virginia. I mean, this is the first time they get together. So they started the meeting, they opened it up, they convened, make sure they had all the people they needed. And one of the very first acts they did was they opened with prayer. But it's not the dinky little prayer like we would use at a city council meeting. This was serious stuff. They went right around the corner to Christ Church and got the Reverend Jacob Duché to come pray. And according to historical records, it looks like that opening prayer session ran for about 2 hours. But they didn't just pray. When you look at the writings of those who were there, like John Adams, who wrote his wife Abigail, he said that they also studied 4 chapters of the Bible that morning, and that God so spoke to them out of one of those chapters, out of Psalm 35, it changed their whole attitude on what might occur. So this is the starting place of what 2 years later led to the Declaration of Independence, and it starts with a strong act of prayer and faith.
Do you know how many people signed the Declaration?
I'm going to guess 5. 13?
13. There were 13 colonies, but every colony sent people to sign it.
12.
Several.
Yeah.
I think a dozen. I'm not sure.
Under 20.
Okay, that's a good one. That's probably about probably close to 60.
50.
No, how about, can I guess?
Absolutely.
54.
You are so close. Do you know how many people signed the Declaration?
It seems like 56 people.
Okay. Now, we also probably should point out where are you from?
I'm from Russia.
From Russia. And you already know more than most Americans do. That's great.
We talked earlier about Carpenter Hall. And at Carpenter Hall, we mentioned that they opened that original session of Congress with prayer, and they did so with the Reverend Jacob Duché of Christ Church coming over to pray. Christ Church is where so many of the Founding Fathers attended church. As a matter of fact, 7 signers of the Declaration are buried here at Christ Church. And one of those signers is Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration from New Jersey. Francis, in addition to designing an early American flag that didn't catch on, he also was a federal judge appointed by George Washington. And on top of that, he's a church music director. He's a choir leader. He played the organ here at Christ Church. And this is actually a hymn book that he did. It's the first hymn book in American history to have musical notation in it. It's the Book of Psalms. He set the entire Book of Psalms to music. And this is the product of a signer of the Declaration who's a strong patriot and a strong Christian.
Do you know the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
The Declaration and the Constitution. I have no clue.
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution? What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
Well, it's in the Declaration about life, liberty, and
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
Well, one was the Constitution was our own statehood when we separated from England, and the other one was
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
I mean, I know the Constitution has certain, like, I guess, way of life.
Well, the Declaration came before the Constitution.
Absolutely.
I know that. It was signed before that. And I think the Constitution was just the official. It seemed like the Declaration was the rough draft.
What's the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution?
So, well, the Declaration of Independence, we became independent from Great Britain.
Yes.
The Constitution was more of once we were independent, like what our rules and regulations or goals were.
Absolutely, yeah. This is how we were going to operate as a government.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
We're in Virginia, which is where the final battle of the American Revolution took place, and this is the home of signer of the Declaration, Thomas Nelson Jr., who was key in that final battle in winning American independence. He was actually one of the younger signers of the Declaration, about 38 years old when he signed the Declaration, but he was a very wealthy man. I mean, this is a very elegant house for that period of time, and he was willing to use his wealth to help advance American independence. And it really cost him a lot of his fortune. And in the early part of the Revolution, the British fleet is coming up to Chesapeake, and that's real close here. And they thought, well, they're going to attack Virginia. Well, what happened was the fleet went on up to Philadelphia. So the first part of the Revolution is really in the northern states. But by the latter part of the Revolution, the British Army is coming here toward Yorktown. And at the same time, the American general who became a traitor, Benedict Arnold, he has now switched over to the British. He's got a fleet of ships, and they're coming up from the other direction. So you've got all of the British forces amassing here at Virginia. And as that's happening, the call goes out that we need help, we need military, we need troops, we don't have enough in the Continental Army. You got to remember that at the time of the American Revolution, when you have all these Americans say, hey, let's take on the British, and the British are the greatest power in the world, nobody thought they could win. I mean, we didn't have our own military. We had a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and store owners, and we'll grab our squirrel guns and do what we can. But nobody thought they were going to win, so nobody loaned them any money. And so as they're running short of troops and supplies, one of the calls goes out from the Continental Congress that says, we're asking young men across the colonies, young men who have any kind of wealth or fortune, to start being banker and bankrolling some groups of artillery and groups of cavalry, etc. And so what young Thomas Nelson did was he got here in Virginia and got a bunch of the young men together, and they brought their horses, and he bankrolled the entire regiment of cavalry here, came out of his pocket. Well, he did that, and they took that cavalry up and helped Washington up north, and then they come back south. And then as they're seeing all the British start to converge here, they recognize, the British have got a lot of ships and a lot of fleets, and we really need some help. And so they get the French fleet to come, but we've got to pay for that. It cost a lot of money. And so Congress went to Thomas Nelson and said, can you see if you can raise several $1 million there in Virginia to help pay for the French fleet to come? And so Thomas Nelson, wealthy, went to all the folks he knew who had money. Everybody said, there's no way we're giving money to the American government. These guys won't win. And so Nelson's like, well, would you give it to me? Well, yeah, we'll loan you money. And so Nelson put his own name on the line and got the money that was needed, but he did it personally at his own expense. So all of the stuff that he's pouring in, and by the way, he was so giving in nature that the state early made him the commander in forces of all the military in the state of Virginia. But in working with George Washington, it's interesting that in the middle of the Revolution, as they're seeing things progress, and we don't have funding, but we keep winning battles, George Washington writes Thomas Nelson a letter, and he says, Thomas, he said, the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and must be more than wicked that hath not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. In other words, Thomas, if people have seen what you and I have seen here, and they don't feel an obligation to acknowledge God for what he's doing, they're just flat wicked. They've got no spiritual heart at all. Thomas Nelson's house goes back to 1730. So we're surrounded with all these old houses. And because this is a nice house, guess where the British officers went? They went in the house. As a matter of fact, Thomas Nelson thought that General Cornwallis, the commander of the British forces, was in his own home because this is where the principal officers were. So it comes time to chase the British out of Yorktown. So the American artillery's out there, and they're just firing away at the town, trying to get the British out. And as Nelson is watching all the artillery being fired downtown, he sees all these houses being hit, except his own house. His house is where the British generals are, and nobody's hitting it. And he goes and asks the artillery guys, how come my house is not getting hit? They said, sir, you're the governor. You're the one bankroll. We're not going to hit your house. He says, well, you ain't. No, we're not going to. So he started offering them money. Every cannon that would hit his house, he would give them money. And so, interestingly, he starts bombing his own house, and cannonballs went through the wall and killed some of the British, and so the British scoot out of here. And so here you have a guy who did so much more for the rest of us. And while people today say, oh, those wealthy guys, well, it may be one thing if you keep all your wealth to yourself, but he was willing to sacrifice all of his wealth for the good of the country. And it was really good that he was willing to do that, because without what he did to bankroll here, the final battle of the Revolution, Yorktown, we might never have won the British. So Thomas Nelson, and by the way, like the others you've seen, he too was a strong man of faith. Way back when this thing started, back at the Boston Tea Party, at the very front end of the Revolution, he's one of the guys who calls for a nationwide day of fasting and prayer. Now, I mentioned how that Thomas Nelson was willing to turn the cannons on his own house when he found that they weren't hitting his house. And here's part of the evidence right here. You see that nice round pock mark right there? Right where a cannonball hit, and it just boom. And you find those pock marks all over the sides of his house. The evidence that he was turning the cannons on his own house. Matter of fact, when you get over here, still got a cannonball right there in it. And the same is true up top. Another cannonball right up there, just all over the side of the house. You have the evidence of his willingness to give his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor, which is what he had pledged to do in the Declaration. And his house bears testimony to the fact that he was willing to keep his word. So you've seen something of the home and life of Thomas Nelson Jr. It's interesting to see what his contemporaries and his peers said about him. For example, this is from James Madison, also a Virginia founder. He said, General Nelson was excelled by no man in the generosity of his nature, in the nobleness of his sentiments, in the purity of his revolutionary principles, and in the exalted patriotism that he answered every service and sacrifice that his country might need.
New York, Diane, my wife, has a granddaughter there. It's great. Brooklyn, we've been there. I enjoy the United States. I've traveled all over the United States. So this compared to what? You know, where would you want to live?
You raised an important point here about the military and the change in people's perception and how they treat the military. Look, I was in D.C. when we celebrated the Army's 250th birthday last month. It's older than the nation itself. But as you just mentioned, I heard from another veterans advocate that it's actually getting harder and harder to get recognition for our great veterans. You said it changed around the time of the Vietnam War. You're a third-generation veteran. How does that make other veterans feel to go through this type of change in America?
It doesn't feel good, but I wouldn't go back and undo what I did. And if I was needed and was called again, which is highly unlikely because I'm a Vietnam veteran, well, it's a dedication. When we raised our right hand and we swore an oath, we didn't have a time limit on that. There was no expiration date. And that's why so many veterans and myself are still serving today, doing things. One of the big things that I think is that veterans can lead the way, and they have many times. If I could ask you a question, what would we do about trying to bring this nation back together? one of the things is veterans who have a lot of education in many cases could be mentoring, could be tutoring children in school, building relationships. Hey, go back, my generation, my uncles, my father, my grandfather, all served in the military. There's very few of us today because it's changed with the all-military military. So we
Well,
need
what
to
could
be
they
out
learn?
in the
Jim, you said veterans could mentor kids. What do you think that they would teach them? What can we learn from our veterans?
Well, let's start with one thing. Basic math and science and English and all of these things. Do you realize, Paul, that the Army and the Navy have started what they call the future sailor or future Army recruit to teach them basic skills, basic education to be able to pass the exams to get in the military? That is an indictment of our school system. Yeah. Oh, listen. Only about 23% of the eligible aged young men and women in the United States can pass the exam, both physical, mental, legal, and all that. We need to be lifting people up. I heard somebody criticizing, saying, well, you guys just lowered the standard. No, we didn't. The military went out and started training people to raise them up. That's the sort of positive thing we need to do.
Why has this fallen in the lap of the military? Do they have some explanation for this? This is incredible.
Well, first and foremost, Paul, our recruitment was way down. And part of the problem was the young men and women couldn't pass the exams, couldn't pass the physicals. So, what do? You lower the standards? No. We're talking about military and having a fighting force. Whether it's someone who is going into the infantry or somebody who's going into supply or somebody who's going into medical, everybody needs to be capable physically and mentally and educationally, intellectually. And so they saw this as a need to be done because our school systems have failed us. One of the things that's happened is the dumbing down of America. And man, we see it. What is the average American's educational reading level today? I hear stories that it's as low as an 8th grade level. Paul, that's horrible, man.
I think if you were to go back, Jim, and look at how the Declaration of Independence was phrased and all of these incredible documents from that period of time and compare it to what you're saying now, it's just incredible. Jim, before we wrap up here, I want to ask you about recent polling that shows that the number of people who say they're proud to be American is actually falling. Now, as we discussed, this story of America is just one of inspiration. It's just quite incredible. Is it just a matter of helping Americans learn more about their history and what it actually means to be American?
I think it's a number of things, Paul. I think it's relationships. I think we don't teach the Pledge of Allegiance in school anymore. Kids don't start the day with that. We need to teach the Pledge of Allegiance. We need to teach the Constitution. A member of your community, Janine Turner, the actress who was in Northern Exposure, she has a wonderful, wonderful 501c3 called Constituting America to teach about the Constitution. We need to teach people about that. They don't know. Now, there's also a lot of people that are angry, and I say, when they're angry, I say, who hurt you? Why are you angry? What do you fear? And let's have a conversation. Let's have communication. One of the things that's happening, in my opinion, is much of the problem that we are facing today is a press that is trying to divide this country. And divided country, Abraham Lincoln said, a nation divided will not stand. And I think there is too many people, and what you're affiliated with and your news and all is outstanding because you're talking about working together. And that's where we need to be doing. Working together, solving problems. That's not to say America doesn't have problems. But here's one of the other things about that poll from Gallup. I'd like to know more about it. Who paid for it? One of the things, if you take a look at the national map of the electorate of who voted for Trump, and you put it on a county by county basis, the only blue spots you run into are in the very, very poor That's where you find a lot of low education. You realize the rest of the map was almost 100% red?
That's right.
So is Gallup poll again misinformation? You know, they might be real insulted when I say that, but hey, let me tell you something. Most of the news that I see outside of outlets like yours and some of the others are disinformation designed to take us apart, designed to divide us.
That's right.
That's horrible.
That's right, Jim. And I think for everybody to be educated in this, in their history, and to know what's going on is so important. Jim, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We'd love to hear more from you. Have a great one, and thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you for what you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
It's faith.
Although it's very evident when you see their writings.
Yeah, another guy that's really key among the founding fathers is this one. This is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Now, interesting, he signs the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and that's because there were 9 Charles Carrolls living at the time in his area. So he's the one from Carrollton, and that's the town and area, and that's his place. And this is one of the documents from him, and this actually says, Mr. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, to the trustees of the Catholic Cathedral Church. He's the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this actually is, he's renting his pew. One of the ways you helped fund the church back then was not only in tithes, and today we have customs. If you go to church much, you know where people generally sit. Well, back then you actually kind of bought the seat where you sit.
So literally, that is my seat.
That is my seat. I paid for that seat. Leave. So that's one of the ways they funded. So this is for 3 months pew rental for a particular pew. But back then, we often again hear the narrative today that there was so much bigotry back then and they were anti-Catholic. The anti-Catholic sentiment was really because these guys will be against what we're trying to do by giving people the freedom to choose their leaders. Well, he certainly wasn't. He's a guy who signed the Declaration of Independence, who stood up against the king, and so he kind of broke the barriers, and they said, oh, look, there is a Catholic that is a pro-Republican Catholic. They want elected government, and so by the time we get to the Constitution, we have more Catholics actually signing the Constitution. So he kind of breaks through some things, and he lives to be really old. He died at the age of 95. Now, age of 95 is not that impressive today, but you need to know that the average lifespan back when they signed the Declaration was 33 years old. So he lives to be 95, and it's interesting that, he kind of outlives his kids and grandkids, and late in life, they're kind of talking to him and said, Charles, you're going to die someday, and when you do die, are you ready to meet God?
Which is a good question.
This is his answer. This is a letter. Charles Carroll, this is 1825, which makes him 89 years old at the time. And am I ready to meet God? And he says, of course I am. He says, on the mercy of my Redeemer, I rely for salvation, and on his merits, not on any works I've done in obedience to his precepts. That's Ephesians 2:8-9. By grace are you saved through faith. And it's interesting, he was the wealthiest guy in America. I mean, he, hands down, wealthier than John Hancock. Interesting to see what he did with his wealth. He lived in a rural part of Maryland where they didn't have a lot of people, so you didn't have enough tithes to be able to have preachers all the time at the churches. So he took his wealth and he endowed a church there, permanently endowed the church, and permanently endowed a preacher so that you would have a preacher to preach the gospel even when there's not enough people to be able to afford to get a preacher in. So he put his money into the gospel stuff as well. Again, great guy, great founding father.
And certainly
this kind of boldness, this confidence. It was like David had this gene open up, this courage, this ability that God put in him before he was born. Now at the appointed time, it came alive. David went out, slung that rock, and defeated Goliath. King Saul nearly passed out. He couldn't see it, but there was treasure in this teenager. There was greatness in this earthen vessel. This was all a part of what God had pre-planned for David. God had already prearranged him to be a giant killer. He had already put in him the talent, the confidence, the skill to bring down Goliath. There are giants in your future that God has already equipped you to defeat. There are dreams that look impossible that God has already empowered you to accomplish. When you look at what you're up against, it can seem daunting. A sickness, financial issue, struggling with an addiction, like David, that potential that's been lying dormant in you is going to suddenly come to life.